The Chosen Season 3 starts off with the biggest sermon that Jesus ever did in his ministry, and that is the Sermon on the Mount. This is one of the most epic ways that they could have started off Season 3, as this gives us more insight into who Jesus is, what he wants to teach, and where his disciples are overall. I love how they incorporate the real scripture from the Sermon on the Mount throughout all of this, and how Jesus is repeating certain things. But then on top of it, we're seeing how Jesus is relating these things to his disciples and the people that are listening to this sermon, including Matthew, Andrew, Zebedee, and even his enemies like Gaius and Atticus. There's some really cool moments here, and I want to dive into it today. But before we get too far into that, I wanted to let you know that if you missed out on our Israel trip for 2023, we are going to be doing another Israel trip in 2024, and it's going to be amazing. I specifically set out to make this trip a little bit cheaper and to make things a little bit easier for you guys to get into. So I would love for you to join us on that trip. All the information is in the description down below, and I'll put it in the pinned comment of this video. Thanks. First, we hear as Jesus speaks about not murdering, and of course this is a horrible thing that everybody knows not to do. But this is when Jesus turns everything on its head. Throughout the entire sermon, Jesus is really intentional about how he talks about sin, how he talks about the wrongdoings that people are a part of. So he quantifies this point by saying that even if you're upset with a brother or have a quarrel with a brother, that this is an issue just as much as murdering. So this is a pretty big standard. Remember, Jesus is taking what the people knew from the law of Moses and from these other things, and he's making it an even higher standard, showing them that there's no way that you can completely follow the law by yourself. But within all of these scriptures as well, he's giving them practical advice on how to become better people overall. So this first one is directed towards Matthew specifically. Remember, he has an issue with his parents, and he hasn't resolved that. So even before he's supposed to be sacrificing, before he's supposed to continue on this journey, what should he do? Well, he should go and try to reconcile with them. We're going to do a whole video on Matthew very soon, so I'm going to wait on this for a little bit. So let's move on to the next piece of scripture. So then we get back to Jesus speaking directly to Andrew. Now we know that Andrew deals a lot with anxiety and worry. We've actually done a whole video about it already on the channel. But we can see here that Andrew is heavily impacted by this part of the sermon, as he thinks of the birds of the air and the lilies of the field, how they're taken care of by God. And of course, he's going to be taken care of by God as well. Then we get some smaller passages that aren't related to anybody specific, but could be directed towards really anybody in the group. First, we hear the golden rule, which is whatever you wish others to do to you, do also to them. This could be really related to anybody, but we kind of glance over the ladies as this is happening. So this could be something that's related to them specifically. Maybe Tamar and Mary are going to learn this lesson as they work out whatever they're working out together. Then we also get judge not, lest you be judged. And this could correlate to Nathaniel. We know that he's very bold in what he says. He doesn't have a filter, and he just kind of says whatever comes to his mind. This could be an issue when he's looking at someone who he deems not to be worthy or not to be good enough, and he kind of spews that out of his mouth. So this could correlate to him, I could see that. Then for some more direct scriptures, we have an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Of course, we're going to hear more about Simon the Zealot over the course of this season, and we're going to see him interact with the Zealots themselves and how they're after him because he is no longer part of the order. This is going to be a big part of the storyline of season 3, I think, and maybe even specifically in episode 6, which is entitled Intensity in Tent City. I'm really excited for Simon's journey and to see how he interacts with everything throughout the 2x2 and everything else, especially since he's with Matthew. What an interesting pairing there. Next, we hear Jesus go into the passage that talks about loving your enemies. He said, "You've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies." And so this is a very upside down way of thinking for the Jewish culture. Remember, when you make enemies, you pay them back, tooth for tooth, right? You know how you're supposed to treat a neighbor. You know how you're supposed to treat an enemy. And so these things are easy to kind of put together. But Jesus is not allowing that to happen. He's saying, love your enemies. No matter what they do or who they are, you should still love them. And this immediately cuts to Yusuf and Atticus Emilius. Now, this is a great use of cinematography, kind of showing what these people are thinking as well, because they see themselves as enemies of the Jews. And of course, the Jews would have seen them as enemies as well. So how does this change their relationship? And how does this change Atticus's view of who Jesus is? saying that they should love their enemies. Of course, this impacted Gaius in one of the most important ways, as we see in episodes 1 and 2. Then we get some really interesting passages that are very famous within the Sermon on the Mount. First, we get the Speclog scripture, which talks about there being a speck in your brother's eye that you're trying to get out, while there's a log in your own eye. And Jesus is explaining here that in order for you to help someone else out with their sin and their issues in their own life, you have to deal with your own first and take out that log so that you can see well enough to help your brother in the first place. This is not directed at anybody specifically that I can tell within the Sermon on the Mount, but it could be addressed to literally everybody, of course. Then we get an interesting scripture that has to do with the culture during the time of Jesus. He talks about if someone forces you to go 1 mile, go 2 miles. And we interpret this as going the second mile, right? This is a common phrase that we use today. But during the time of Jesus, this was actually a law that was enacted by the Romans. If a Roman soldier came to you and said, I want you to carry my armor and my supplies a mile outside the city, then you had to do it. And there was actually a mile marker outside of every city on the road so that you would know when to drop their stuff. But what Jesus is saying is, even though they're forcing you to do this, even though they're putting you in this weird position, go an extra mile. Show them that you love them beyond what the law is forcing you to do. And just like everything else in this sermon, this would have been a very strange sentiment as well. Now, throughout this entire scene, we get little glimpses of the Lord's Prayer as they kind of finish it throughout. And as Jesus is saying it out loud, we see as the disciples are mouthing it behind him, showing that they have learned this prayer very well and that they probably pray it every day. We've also seen from behind the scenes footage that Matthew and Simon are going to be teaching this to more people later on during the 2x2 as well. Next, we get Jesus teaching about how you should store your treasures in heaven and not in earthly things, not in material possessions. And this is interesting because we actually focus directly on Zebedee. And at first I wasn't sure exactly why, but I think this actually brings us all the way back to season 1. Remember, Zebedee, he was breaking the law. He was breaking the rules in order for him to fish on Shabbat so that he could make more money. I don't think that Zebedee was ultra poor and just needed to do this to survive like Simon was trying to do. He was doing this because, well, nobody else was out fishing and he could get the most amount of fish and he could have his men make more money. This is potentially why the camera focuses on him during this specific verse. And although he hasn't met him yet, I think this is also for Judas. We know that Judas has an issue with money, and we're going to see more and more of that throughout the seasons, so it would make sense this is directed towards him as well, but obviously falling on deaf ears. And then this segment of the Sermon on the Mount ends with Jesus speaking about the parable of the house built on the rock. And of course, he is the rock. I love how they used so many of the different sections of the Sermon on the Mount in this section of episode 1 of season 3. Seriously, a great job, and I love how they correlated it to all the different people within the group. It's really cool. And we can even see later on that Matthew's father was actually impacted by this as well. If you want to help me create more videos just like this, then go over to our Patreon and sign up for that. There's a $5, $10, and $25 tier that really help us out month to month to keep on doing this ministry. And if you want to join our Israel trip in 2024, there's also links down in the description down below to do that. Anyway, we'll see you on the next one. Peace.